The word social justice generates different emotions for every one of us. And from every end of the spectrum, there's different responses and how people will respond to social justice. For some people, it just ignites them, and for some people, it depresses them, and everywhere in between. There's a great story in the Gospel of Mark that I want to read to you and discuss with you that sort of helps us to set a foundation for social justice. And as followers of Christ, we really don't have a choice about it, because Jesus said that the way that we love God is through loving people. And the people that are most important to love are the disenfranchised, the widows, the orphans, the people in prisons, the needy, those people who are sort of on the fringes of society. That's what Jesus said. Those are the people that are most deserving, and that's the most important place to express our love. So we don't really have a choice, but for many of us, it's difficult to know how to put that into action. And so I want to discuss that and talk with you about that a little bit this morning. I want to do so by reading to you an event that happens in Mark chapter 11. Now, Mark chapter 11 is actually happening at the very end of Jesus' ministry. It's during the week of Passover, most likely. There's two different recordings of it, and there may have been another instance, but this one in particular is referring to that. And so let me read it to you and then talk about it a little bit. So he gets to Jerusalem, and in verse 15, this is what it says. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." When I was studying at Western University, I took a class in psychology. Well, my major is in psychology. And in one of my classes, I remember we were having a discussion about love and about the importance of love for humans to experience and to be people that were loving. And one of the students, a young lady, raised her hand and spoke up, and she said, "You know, all this discussion reminds me of the person of Jesus Christ." And the professor looked at her and he said, "I don't really think of Jesus as a loving being at all. Have you heard of the story of the clearing the temple? He took whips and he drove those people. That doesn't sound loving to me. Does that sound like a loving person to you?" And the room was just deathly silent. And this poor young lady stood there somewhat in horror, and I never saw her again after that. But it was obvious to me then and now that his perception of Jesus and his perception of the church had been influenced by experiences that he had. And knowing something later about his lifestyle and who he was, I think that he was a person that was experiencing exclusion from the church. So part of our response to social justice is formed by the experiences that we've had and by our worldview and how we view the world that we live in. And so, but first of all, I think it's important for me to unpack this story a little bit. And I probably have done this in the past, but I want to unpack it for you again so that you can sort of see what is happening there. And something which he totally did not understand, obviously, from his comments. When God set up his relationship to the people of Israel, and he set up the rules for engagement with him, the rules of worship, he did so in such a way that everyone could be a participant. And some of the things that were required of them were to worship together, and there was something it was required for them to express generosity and to express thanksgiving back to God, because it's good for us to do that. Isn't that God needs it, but it's good for us to do that. It's a way that says that we have more than we truly need, and we need to share that. And so one of the things that every person was supposed to do was to bring a lamb once a year to the temple and to have it offered. And the priest got part of the lamb. Sometimes the poor got part of the lamb, but the lamb was given. By the time of Christ, the religious leaders had discovered ways of increasing their own personal gain through a number of systems of scams, and one of which was that you couldn't bring your own lamb. When a lamb was brought, the priest had to decide that it was all right, that it was not blemished, that it didn't have anything wrong with it. And so they figured out this way of ensuring that by saying the only lambs you could bring were ones that they could sell you. So you couldn't bring your own lamb, you had to buy one of theirs, which was elevated in price, obviously expensive. Another thing that they did was they instituted, based on a distortion of some early scriptures, that you had to pay a temple tax. And when you came into the church, it wasn't just a voluntary offering, you actually were charged a tax fee. But you couldn't pay with your own money. They actually coined their own coins, they were called the temple coins, and you had to buy the temple coins to pay your temple tax at also an exorbitant rate. So that's what the money changers were doing. They were taking and exchanging your money for the temple money, the money that wasn't good anywhere else in the world except to pay the temple tax. And so they would collect the tax, they'd turn around and sell it to you again. And so the priests were becoming wealthy on those two regards. The other thing that was happening was, a little ditty was going through my mind this morning, a Christmas ditty, something about put a penny in the old man's shoe. If you don't have a penny, a half penny will do. If you don't have a half penny, then God bless you. So, it sort of covers them all. And the same was true there. If you couldn't afford a lamb, and there was also a grain offering. Let me tell you about the grain offering first. You were supposed to bring a grain offering, but if you weren't a farmer, if you were poor and didn't have grain, farmers were required to leave an area along the edge of their fields for the poor to come and glean, not only for themselves to eat, but also so that they would have something to bring as an offering. The same was true of if you grew grapes, you were only allowed to go through the fields one time. You couldn't go back and see if you missed anything. And the poor were allowed to follow you behind and to pick the grapes or the grain that you missed the first time through, so they could bring those. And the same is true of a lamb. If you didn't have a lamb, it was acceptable for you to bring a dove. And these were little common birds that were all over Israel. And, I remember as a little boy catching birds with a cardboard box and a stick and a string. That actually works. I did that. I caught little birds. And it's pretty easy for them to set up snares and catch these little doves, and they could bring those. But again, the priests were saying to them, no, you can't use a wild dove, you have to use one that we provide for you. And so what was enraging Jesus was this place that was supposed to be inclusive was in fact making it very difficult for some of the people to come and to meet God. And it wasn't becoming a house of prayer, it was becoming a house of extortion and exclusion. So our first response is to becoming people with a sense of social justice is to realize that we are part of something which is much larger than ourselves, that we are actually people of this world. And Jesus says the statement there that the temple was a place for the world to experience God. And all of us, because of our experiences with the world and the fact that we tend to be people that are grouped, we worship in the church we're comfortable in. We live in the community we're comfortable in. We vote with the people that we're comfortable with. We have all these groups that we are in, and it's very easy for us to think that's the world, that this is the world, and to be a little uncomfortable with anybody that's on the other side of the fence. One of the things that's been really helpful to me in my lifetime, in fact, just in the last decade, has been DNA mapping. There's this little commercial that goes on that maybe some of you have seen where people discover they thought they were Italians and it turns out they're Irish or whatever, because you can send in some of your DNA and they'll tell you exactly where you're from. And I think it's a plot by the government to get us all in their data registers. But just kidding. But what that tells us, and what genetic mapping it tells us, is that we are all related. That every single one of us is from a particular tribe in North Africa, from one particular woman. We are all related. There's this little jingle, it's probably not politically correct anymore, but it goes, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves little children of the world. And we say that, but we don't necessarily believe it. And unfortunately, there are many times in the world in which the church has practiced exclusion. Russ has a great story from his childhood when his mom came here from Africa to Florida, and she was newly becoming acquainted with Christ and following Christ, and went to a nearby church, and they politely told her that she'd be better off going down the street and worshiping with her own kind. So there is that sense in all of us that we want to stay with who we are, but the gospel tells us that we need to be people who are people of the planet. And that in that sense, we need to be involved in what is happening in our planet and have a sense of social justice, not in Maple Valley or in Covington, but in our world. Another thing which affects our sense of social justice is our own life experiences. When I was a young child in grade school, every summer my parents would take all of us down to the fields in Kent. There was just farms all the way from from Renton to Auburn. And we would spend a lot of our summers down there picking and plucking and misbehaving, but also making a little bit of money. And that money, it was expected, would buy our school clothes in the fall. If we got new school clothes, it's because we were down there picking beans. And so that influences my sense of social justice. That life experience says to me, you know what? People can find money if they need it. They don't need my money. That affects my sense of social justice, that experience. But you know what's interesting? As you read the scriptures about caring for the poor, there's never any exclusions in there. There's never any verses that say, take care of the poor if it makes sense, or if it's a good investment, or if it really works. Only do those things that really help the poor. There aren't any verses like that. It just simply says, you know what? You need to help the poor. I read a story once about a young girl who was part of a family. Let's call them the Smith family. And they had lots of kids and not a lot to do. And they were part of this little church. And one Christmas season, the pastor announced that they were all going to chip in and raise money for one of the poor families in the community. And so they got back home, and Mr. Smith said, man, this is a great idea. Let's do everything we can to raise money for this poor family. And all of them did things. They worked and they made, they sold, they did chores. And by the end of the season, they had accumulated $20, which was a not horrific, but a tremendous amount of money. And they were so excited that Sunday morning to put their $20 in the offering plate for the poor family. And at the end of the service, the pastor got up and said, I am so happy to announce to you that we have raised $24 for the poor family in our community. And this year, I'm also happy to tell you that the family is the Smith family. And she talks about them driving home after the service that Sunday. I'm not sure they went back to church, and she said, for the first time, I felt poor. I'd never felt poor before that. But for the first time, I felt poor because somebody told me I was poor. So your life experiences do affect your view of social justice. And sometimes you need to move beyond that. And you just say, God, what do I need to do? What do I need to change here? It also can be a factor of your personality. I tend by nature to be a very frugal person. And I think people that are frugal have a hard time being people who are generous and giving. And honestly, I think that has always made it difficult for me to enjoy Christmas. I don't want to give, and I'm just as fine not to get. Because if I get, then I might feel obligated to give. There's a psychological thing that I do that I recognize with myself. And when we were wandering around San Antonio, I don't know when I've been in a city where there have been more people asking for money. I mean, they're just everywhere. It's just like I don't go down, maybe it's like that in Seattle too, I don't go down very often, but it was just like every time you turn around, there's somebody, do you have any change? Do you have $1, whatever? And see, in my mind, I'm thinking, I read a report that said that's not how you should respond to the poor, because it's not a good investment. The best thing to do is to give to missions, because missions not only give them what they need, but they train them and help them out of their poorness. So I say to myself, now this is not a good investment. But I also recognize I'm not giving to the mission. I'm just being a hypocrite. I'm just avoiding being generous and giving to the poor, and I'm ignoring those verses that says, you know what? It doesn't have to be a good investment. They're poor, and you need to give to them. Another thing that I find myself doing, there are causes that come up on the TV, and I look at those causes. Maybe it's a frog in Costa Rica. Help us save this frog in Costa Rica. Sorry, my voice is starting to sound cynical, isn't it? Sorry. But you know what I think? There are children starving in Africa. Why would I send you my money to save a frog in Costa Rica? And there's truth there. But you know what? I'm not sending money to save the children in Africa. It's just an excuse I make with myself to make myself feel better about the fact that I'm selfish and I'm not very giving. So our worldview, the way that we've been brought, even our own personalities, can prevent us from truly being people who are involved in loving our planet, involved in rectifying some of the things that happen to the poor, to the disenfranchised, to the people of our world that simply don't have what we have. And so of all seasons, this season of Advent, this season of God giving everything to us, it should be a season where we re-examine our hearts, re-examine our lives and say, what am I going to do? I haven't heard this year, but in past years, the amount of money that people spend per person on Christmas is ridiculous. But I think what's even more ridiculous is that we don't spend that much money investing in the poor, in the people of our world that are suffering, the people of our world that are being treated unjustly, and beyond even the people, the planet itself, and the environment, the people, the things in our planet. All those things are important and part of redemption. So this Advent season, as we begin this examination of love, I think the very first place that we need to begin is examining our hearts, examining our generosity, examining our spirit of giving, and say, God, change me. Make me a person that's more like Christ. Stand together with me and let me dismiss us with a benediction. God, your love and your generosity is so abundant throughout Scripture. Your love for mankind, for people, your love for this planet are all things that we need to emulate. And so I pray this morning for the spirit of generosity for every one of us, the spirit of hope, the spirit of love for one another and for this wonderful creation, and ultimately for you. Amen.